Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Stephen King podcast. This is another bonus episode, and I have a special guest. All my guests are special, but this one is extra special. Robert J. Sawyer, science fiction writer from Mississauga, Canada. Hello, sir. How are you doing?
I'm doing just fine, Lou. How are you?
Not too bad. It's been a while since we've seen each other, and unfortunately, that's not going to happen this year because we usually meet up at When Words Collide in Calgary in August. But of course, with the COVID lockdown, that's not going to happen this year.
It's really disappointing. I think it's disappointing to readers and writers everywhere. Book collectors, too. You know, conventions. We're talking about a genre fiction convention that's held in Calgary, When Words Collide. But there's science fiction conventions, fantasy conventions, horror conventions. The one and only time I ever met Stephen King, who is, of course, the normal subject of this podcast, was the World Fantasy Convention when it was in Ottawa way back in maybe the late 80s. Right. So, yeah, you know, this is kind of, in the grand scheme of things, nothing at all in terms of hardships that people are dealing with. But in terms of a literary life, the death of the convention circuit for a year is really, really hard to take.
Yes, and we hope it only is a year. Just a little intro you a little better for our listeners who may not be familiar with you. As I mentioned off the top, Robert is a science fiction writer from Canada. He's only one of 8 writers to win the Nebula, the Hugo, and the John Campbell Memorial Award. Familiar people with Robert might probably best know him from an ABC TV series that was based on one of his books, and that was Flash.
No, it wasn't. It was Flash Forward.
Flash Forward.
But you're flashing back because
I am flashing back. Yes.
10 years since Flash Forward was on the Alphabet Network, as they call it, ABC. That's right.
Right. Okay. So we've kind of touched upon it already, but with this whole COVID experience, and I know for you, because of the work that you do, and not because you're only a writer, you're also a speaker, and you usually have a pretty hefty itinerary, and you do a lot of traveling. So I wonder what the cabin fever level for you is at right now.
So this has been kind of fascinating, Lou, because you're exactly right. I spend typically 4 months of the year on the road.
Wow.
Divided into a lot of trips, a week here, 10 days there, a weekend somewhere else.
Yep.
But it adds up to months and months and months of time.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been maintaining that pace since, I've been a science fiction novelist for 30 years now, since 1990. It's really about 20 years ago that my career really took off. And so for 20 years, I've been maintaining a pace like that. And I thought, you mentioned cabin fever, I thought I would go nuts. In fact, I'm actually fairly content. And I say that as a man whose book tour should have been this past month for my 24th novel, got entirely canceled because of COVID-19, because of the pandemic. But I have been content to be at home. I have a lovely home in a suburb of Toronto.
Mm-hmm.
I've been content to catch up on my reading, to read for pleasure. And, you think you're going to miss all your friends. Now, when you think about it, they're like 5 people that I really miss.
Right.
Right. I wish I could, and if you're listening, you're one of the 5. But, there are people, it's always a pleasure. You run into them once, twice a year. It's always a pleasure. It's nice.
Yep.
They're part of the fabric of your life. But in terms of really feeling heartbroken about all of this, I'm surprised. Now, I normally thought of as a gregarious person.
Mm-hmm.
I'm surprised at how content I have been to go back to what a literary life would have been in the previous, a century ago.
Right.
Which would have been a life of just reading and thinking about books.
Yep.
And writing in isolation and peace and quiet. And, that's not a bad life.
No. And I think we are, in one sense, fortunate because we have the internet and we are able to do so many things virtually that, 10, 15 years ago, we wouldn't have. It would have been probably a lot more difficult even 20 years ago to be under this kind of scenario.
It's astonishing, of course, as a science fiction writer, obviously, I've been aware of video conferencing and, all the technologies that have been there. As William Gibson, a fellow Canadian science fiction writer of considerable repute, has long said the future is already here. It's just not widely distributed yet. And I think, if I can riff on that, the future has been here for a long time, just hasn't been widely adopted yet. People who had no idea that you could, for free, video conference with people in Australia, New Zealand, and China, and Japan, and Canada, and the United States simultaneously at high resolution video and high fidelity audio, are stunned to find that, all you have to do is go to the right website and that technology is freely available. It's the same with, I do some of my writing with dictation and voice recognition. I happen to use Dragon Naturally Speaking because I'm on a Windows system. There are competitors on the Mac and so forth.
Right.
It's astonishingly good. And people who either have never heard of this capability or think it's still, something out of Star Trek, or people who tried it 10 or even 20 years ago, and of course it was pathetic back then, are stunned to discover, oh, wow, this, it really works.
Right.
And if you say Antifa, a phrase that's in the news right now, it gets it. It knows it. It's like, I don't have to spell that out, phonetic alphabet, Able November or Alpha November, Tango or whatever it is, Idaho. You don't have to do that.
Right.
It's boom, boom, boom. The stuff works. So you're exactly right. It is so much easier to take this worldwide crisis because of the technology that exists, even 10 years ago, when most people did not have broadband, when most people were still on a very restricted amount of data they could push through their web access, and some people were still paying by the minute or by the hour for it.
Right.
It would have been much more burdensome than it is today.
Yes. It's interesting that you mentioned Dragon Naturally Speaking, because I think it's Kevin J. Anderson is totally does all his books by dictation, goes on hikes and whatnot. So
yes, now what he does exactly is he records and doesn't even look at, when I use Dragon, it's being transcribed on my screen. I can see boom, boom, boom.
Yep.
And if it gets a word wrong, I go back and I change this as I'm doing it. Kevin just dictates into a digital recorder and hands it over to his secretary when he's done. The secretary, of course, doesn't listen these days, just dumps it into voice recognition software, and then she goes and corrects the manuscript as need be before Kevin ever sees it. So absolutely, Kevin is, he's in great shape because, as you say, he does it while he hikes and he lives in the Colorado Rockies. And B, he's way more prolific than almost any other author I know because he's taking full advantage of the technology that's available to him.
And I'll use that as a segue, the technology point, because while it has made it easier for everyone to communicate virtually, it also has had a big impact on the state of publishing. And I know through your experiences with your last book, you've seen a different world and just over the course of your career, of course, as well. So I'm curious, or I'd like to hear what you think about where publishing is today for writers, old, new, starting out.
Well, again, we're talking about a technological revolution. My current novel, it's called The Oppenheimer Alternative, has a traditional print publisher in the United States and a separate traditional print publisher in Canada. And I wanted two things, and only two things, from those print publishers. I wanted distribution into brick and mortar physical bookstores.
Right.
And I wanted, maybe I only wanted one thing. I can't even think of what the other one was. I wanted the legitimacy of a print edition that went with the literary touring of a book.
Right.
So besides the science fiction and fantasy festivals we've talked about, there's a whole raft of mainstream, let's call them, literary festivals where writers are brought in to read and they get paid to read and their books are sold. And it's mostly attended by an older clientele who perhaps has a fair bit of disposable income, but those are a lot of fun, and they've been a part of my life for a long time.
Right.
Well, what are the two things I wanted from print publishing were taken away from me this year, because the bookstores that the Oppenheimer Alternative should have been in when it came out on June 2nd of this year were all closed because of COVID-19. And the literary festivals, as well as the genre fiction conventions, were all shut down. So I got very, very little, except a couple of nice physical volumes, a Canadian and American edition, to put on my brag shelf. From what's been my bread and butter through all this is electronic publishing. And I went, instead of to my big publishers that I've worked with in the past, such as Ace Science Fiction and Tor in the United States and Penguin Canada in Canada, I went to smaller publishers, respected, and my American publisher also publishes Robert A. Heinlein. My Canadian publishers repeatedly won the Governor General's Award, the top literary prize in Canada. They're not inconsiderable houses by any means, but they were willing to give me concessions that I could not get from really big publishers, the big five that dominate print publishing in North America.
Right.
And that was, I wanted to have, for me, 100% of the ebook rights. And I wanted to have, for me, 100% of the audiobook rights. Well, those particular trades have flourished in this lockdown situation. So that, fortunately, my book, and of course, if you self-publish a book on Amazon, you can go and look hour by hour, day by day at how many copies have sold. You can see when you do a podcast or you do a major print interview or whatever, what bump you get if that's actually translating to people saying, oh, that guy sounds interesting, I'll go buy his book. So if I had to do it again, given that I didn't get the things that I wanted out of print publishing at all, and maybe am still doing just fine in terms of finding an audience and in terms of making money, maybe next time, if there is another Robert J. Sawyer novel after the Oppenheimer Alternative, maybe next time I'll do it entirely on my own. We talk about technologies that are mature, and certainly self-publishing as a technology is mature now. It is very easy, without being technologically savvy, for an author to go from a manuscript done in Word or in any other word processor that produces Doc or DocX or RTF formats, to go from that manuscript to a well-formatted ebook. You still should get a decent cover. I paid for the cover art that I have on my ebook edition, and I'm very glad that I did. Very terrific designer named Avery Olive at Bibliofic Designs in Alberta, Canada, but she works internationally. That was money well spent. But that was because of all the skills in terms of packaging an ebook. It was the only one that I myself did not have. That, I could write the text brilliantly myself, hopefully brilliantly myself. But there are times where you will pay for a professional still to get a good cover or a good physical layout if you're doing print-on-demand publishing. But absolutely, the options for authors have changed enormously. And I'm going to wag a finger here at Stephen King, since this is the Stephen King podcast. Well, remember when he started out, and early days, and he said, I'm going to serialize a novel. I'm going to do it as long as there continues to be interest in it. Well, who would sign on board for that? Who would say, oh, I'm going to start a story that might or might not get finished, not based on whether I have participated by buying the story, but how many other people choose to be part of this grand experiment. I actually think I'll do credit to Stephen for all kinds of great things he has done for other writers and for the publishing industry, but that set back e-publishing because he said I'm committed, and if you want to come on board, here's how you get my next work. He said, I'm dabbling. I'm putting a toe in the waters. I'm seeing if the seas are friendly. And if they aren't, I'm going to abandon you mid-story. And I think that really hurt in the way that another author of his stature, or almost his stature these days, nobody is Stephen King's stature, of course, George R.R. Martin has really hurt the ongoing series novel by not finishing the Game of Thrones series. And, now he says, now that there's a lockdown, maybe I'll get it finished. I mean, come on, dude, right? I hear over and over again, you laugh and we can make light of it, but I hear over and over again people saying, I just bought the Oppenheimer Alternative. I'm so happy that it's a standalone because I'm not going to get burned again. Mm-hmm. I will not start a series until the series is finished. Right?
Yeah, I've seen that. I've seen that a lot.
Of course. Yep. Of course, you have an obligation. When you have an audience the size that George has, or J.K. Rowling has, or Stephen has, you've got an obligation. You make a deal with them saying, you buy into the first book, I'm gonna finish this. Stephen did not do that as a promise. He, in fact, made the exact opposite. I don't know if I'm going to finish this when he started ebooks. And George broke the promise to his readers. And now, everybody wishes him good health. Everybody wishes that the books will come out. Everybody wishes that they will have a better conclusion than the TV series version that got ahead of him. Mm-hmm. But also, we have to say there is the King effect was a real thing on holding back the adoption of self-publishing. And the Martin effect is a real thing in holding back the success of new authors who want to launch series.
Mm-hmm. I'll just defend King a little bit on that. I agree with majorly with your point, but I think he just brought that idea out a bit too soon, and the technology wasn't there to make it easily available to everybody. And in terms of George Martin, I don't really know what his problem is, because basically all he has to do is adapt the TV episodes now. Most of his work's done for him. I know he wants to do his own vision, of course, but I'm just making a small joke there.
Let me give you the flip side here, because I'll say a word in defense of George. He, of course, was not Stephen King in terms of fame and fortune before Game of Thrones, right?
Or output.
Or output. He was a respected writer. And he had a decent following, but he had no idea that he was going to become insanely rich. And when he became insanely rich, he struck the jackpot. The TV series, the books themselves were a huge success. The TV series gave him a fame and notoriety that most authors never have in their lifetime. And George is not a young man. I'm going to say he was born in 1948. I think that's right, which I think would make him 72 this year. Certainly in that ballpark. Why not enjoy the fruits of it all? My God, if it comes to you late in life, better than it never coming to you at all. And if he can indulge, as he did just recently, in buying a railway, middle initials are RR, railroad, and he did buy one in New Mexico. If he can indulge himself and have fun and live the high life that most authors can only ever dream about, in that sense, I want to say more power to him. King was lucky. King became rich and famous as a reasonably young man, right out of the gate with Carrie. It took a long and there are others, Michael Crichton, right out of the gate, J.K. Rowling. I mean, Crichton wrote his John Lang novels before, he did some journeyman work before Andromeda Strain made him both rich and famous, the first book under his own name in 1969. Rowling with the first, Harry Potter. There are authors who get this early enough in life. Martin got it late in life. And I can't begrudge them. God knows what I would do if the gods smiled on me, if the Oppenheimer Alternative suddenly became, a mega bestseller, or flip side, if I just literally, as opposed to figuratively, won the lottery. God knows what I would do if suddenly I had all the money that I could possibly want and the mortality that all of us have to deal with.
Right. Yeah, and I think, as you also mentioned, his age, I do think as writers get older, they slow down, and it's the creative juices aren't as easy to tap upon as they were when you were younger. So, and he's got the weird scenario of his story in at least one form has already been told. So the impetus for him to complete it in another version it's probably a bit harder hill to climb because of that too. So.
It's got to be enormously difficult. Really, it does. I have no lack of sympathy for the task in front of him.
Mm-hmm.
Not only does he have to do something that's already been done,
Yeah.
but do it better
Yeah.
than it was already done, or else people are going to say, well, what was the point? I mean, you made this joke. He's gone from being essentially a novelist to a novelizer, and that's not the trajectory he had in mind.
No, exactly.
None of us have in mind, right?
Yeah.
None of us have.
No, for sure.
Okay,
that was a nice tangent. I appreciate that. But just to get back to state of publishing, one thing I was surprised by, and believe that these stats were pre-COVID, but audiobook sales were actually outpacing other forms of book sales. Is that true? And was that true for you?
Yes. This is one of the reasons every major publisher, and only 5 big publishing houses left, right?
Mm-hmm.
You think of, we talk about something like Tor or Ace. Tor is a part of the vast Macmillan empire. And Ace is part of the vast Penguin Random House empire. Like everybody is, swallowed up the food chain.
Mm-hmm.
And in the last 5 years in particular, those publishers have said, oh my God, audio, which we mostly ignored, has become gigantic. And so they will now have, in the same kind of contract they would have given you 5-10 years ago,
mm-hmm.
where it says the grant of right is to publish the book. 20 years ago, the contract said to publish the book in print.
Mm-hmm.
15 years ago, it would say in print and ebook edition. No increase in the advance, but we get both those platforms. Now, for the last 5 years, it's ebook, print, and audiobook. No increase in the advance,
mm-hmm.
but we get all those platforms. Now, the difference between where it was with ebook and print book is there was real truth in the matter that somebody who was a reader would buy one or the other. So that if I sell an ebook, it means that my print publisher probably did not sell a print book. What's the difference with audiobook is audio is an expansion of the consumption marketplace
mm-hmm.
for fiction and nonfiction. It's not a cannibalization of that marketplace. If somebody buys an audiobook of the Oppenheimer Alternative, it's because they commute, or it's because they treadmill,
right.
or go for jogs, or are a long-haul trucker, or take lots of airline flights and they don't like reading on a plane, or whatever it is.
Sure.
They are consuming fiction and nonfiction at times of the day that previously they could not consume it at all.
Right.
So an audiobook sale is 9 times out of 10 a sale that wouldn't have occurred otherwise.
Right.
And so in particular, publishers really want those. It was kind of zero sum. If somebody was going to read Rob Sawyer, the publisher wanted to have that money.
Right.
Whether they were reading him on a screen or reading him on paper, the publisher said, well, we want a piece of the reading action. Listening to Rob Sawyer is a whole additional layer of market. And they're saying, well, as reading is declining, as book sales are down, my God, we want to control every way in which people consume prose text, whether it's as read to them, whether it's on a screen, or whether it's on a dead tree.
Okay. And now I'm curious about, and maybe this is just me because I'm getting older. I find my reading tastes have changed. I don't know if yours have, but I'm not reading as much science fiction as I used to. And I understand that's normal as somebody gets older. I'm actually more interested in thrillers and things of that nature nowadays. So I'm just wondering, from your perspective, what's the state of sci-SF? Is it the same as it ever has been? Is it better, worse? What's your take on it?
You know, we stand on the shoulders of giants. Everybody who is writing today, everybody who writes horror today is standing on King's shoulders. King was standing on Edgar Allan Poe's shoulders, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the best fiction in every category of fiction being written in the history of the human race is being written today because we all build on what the previous generations of writers have done. Mm-hmm. Right? They've invented new techniques, new ways of telling stories. You know, it's often said that the use of italics to emphasize particular emphasis in speech, as opposed to just for the titles of books or something, it goes back to J.D. Salinger, right? It's a fairly recent invention as a typographic convention. for instance. So we all have a toolkit that's broader than it used to be because other people have figured out interesting ways that work. They did the experiments. We reap the rewards. And we try our own experiments. Some succeed, some fail.
Right.
So absolutely, the best science fiction ever being written is being written today. And I despair when somebody who thinks they're introducing somebody to the joys of science fiction hands a modern reader, and these are books that I loved, and you may have loved them dearly as well, Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogy.
Right.
Or Larry Niven's Ringworld. Larry Niven is still writing. He and Greg Benford just had their newest novel, Glorious, come out. And Glorious is a better novel than Ringworld in terms of prose, in terms of characterization. Well, of course it is. Ringworld is 50 years old now. Larry is standing on his own shoulders, right? Came out in 1970. Wow. Larry is standing on his own shoulders as a giant, right? Has got a half century more craft under his belt. And Asimov is all but unreadable. His prose is clunky. There's not a person of color or let alone any gender, range of gender expression. There's not any gender. There's virtually no sexuality or romance in his work except as a mooning 17-year-old boy, which is the age he was when he started publishing, had as a conception of what interpersonal relationships between adults might be like.
Yeah.
A vanishingly few of the great works have held up. Maybe Dune within science fiction.
Which actually has characters, right?
Has characters and sweep and epic and beautiful prose.
Yeah.
And even that, Dune is famously the novel that everybody reads voraciously through to the end the third time they try it. They give up the first 2 times. They can't get through the first 50 or 100 pages. And once you finally get enmeshed and immersed into Frank Herbert's creation, then you just can't put it down. But it is a giant ask to say to somebody, here, try this. So I would say, there are fantastic writers writing today. And voices like N.K. Jemisin, of course, has got 3 consecutive best novel Hugos under her belt. And Nnedi Okorafor, to name a couple of really prominent writers of color who are also female writers on the stage right now, who are giving us a vigor in the genre that we possibly didn't have in decades gone by. And also just the old white men like me are doing the best work, and you are doing the best work of our lives too right now. The Oppenheimer Alternative is my 24th novel, and review after review after review is saying, in some sense, very kindly, it's the best thing Sawyer's ever written, which is, all writers are insecure. So my immediate response, what? The other stuff wasn't any good? But you know what I mean? We're doing our best work of our lives because every year you get better at your craft.
Yeah.
You may not have the energy you had. You may not put in a 14-hour day at the keyboard anymore.
Right.
But if you're still thoughtful and caring, you're doing the finest work of your life. So there's great science fiction. To name a couple of, I named a couple of prominent writers people have already heard of in terms of Nora Jemisin and Nnedi Okorafor. But Derek Kunskin is a brand new science fiction writer, a fellow Canadian. And The Quantum Magician is, if you like Larry Niven, if you enjoyed Ringworld for its range of alien species and its huge ideas, well, my God, you should go and get. It sounds almost like it might be a fantasy. It's not. It's hard science fiction. The Quantum Magician by Derek Kunskin, K-U with 2 dots over the U. Kunskin, Kunsken. Gerald Brandt, a really fine science fiction writer from Winnipeg, Manitoba. There's some great new writers emerging on the scene right now, even as we speak. And we're getting, for the first time in really ever, there was a little bit of, I'm just going to mute my microphone and take care of that. You sing the theme from Star Trek there, Lou.
I will just
Beyond the Rim of the Go.
I will just edit this out. Well, I could do that. Beyond the Rim of Starlight, my love is wandering in starflight.
There we are.
There's some strange love. Yep.
for the first time, really since a little bit in the 1960s, when we got a tiny bit of Soviet science fiction, mostly the Strugatsky brothers, translated into English. We're suddenly getting huge amounts of Chinese science fiction being translated to English. And China, of course, and Soviet science fiction are interesting for the same reason. Repressive regimes talking obliquely, the citizens of those regimes, talking obliquely about matters that they could not openly talk about because of threats of censorship or censure, including jail and death. So we're reminded how powerful and important science fiction is. It was always, going right back to Mary Shelley and H.G. Wells, a literature talking about issues of the day. And the original Planet of the Apes, which I love dearly, which is a riff on race relations and the fear of nuclear war. We're reminded by the stuff that's coming to us from China and the fine works being produced by diverse writers right now, that science fiction always was meant to be about something, in the way that The Twilight Zone, we go back to the 50s and 60s, and Star Trek, the original series, was social commentary. And we have as many, if not more, important things to talk about today, and are finally really reckoning with today, than science fiction ever dealt with in the past. And so I would say it's a vigorous, healthy genre that sadly is read by very few people.
Yeah, I know you've made the remark before about, I think there was a big divergence when science fiction sort of went mainstream, and that of course happened with the original Star Wars. That sort of colored a lot of people's, or the average Joe out there, their ideas of what science fiction was all about. Whereas a movie like Arrival, based on the Ted Chiang's short story, is really the kind of science fiction that science fiction fans are interested in.
That's right. And we get one or two of those a decade. We get an Arrival. We get a Gattaca.
Ex Machina.
We get an Ex Machina.
Yeah.
And those are answers to trivia questions now, right?
Yeah.
They're not the top grossing films of all time. The ones that tend to be spectacle and escapism. Avatar, the top grossing film, it beat the previous record of the same director, James Cameron, Titanic. They tend to be comic book films, superhero films. We have more thoughtful science fiction on television these days. The Handmaid's Tale on Hulu. The Orville, for all of its blustery good humor, is very thoughtful.
Yeah.
And it's also now on, I believe, Hulu.
The Expanse.
Discovery. Yeah. Star Trek, The Expanse on Sci-Fi. Discovery and Picard on CBS All Access. And HBO with Westworld.
Yes.
The thoughtful stuff is, and except for the one example we mentioned, The Expanse on Sci-Fi, the thoughtful stuff is on mainstream carriers, right? Not a genre specialty channel. It's on mainstream channels, and it's in television and in books, but not in film. As I say, once or twice a decade, we're gifted with a film. There was also, District 9.
Yes.
2009, 11 years ago now. But nobody remembers, except for science fiction buffs like you and me, Gattaca, District 9, Ex Machina, or Arrival. I remember that. And they're not, pining for it. But when's the next DC or the next Marvel movie? When do we get more Wonder Woman? When do we get more Captain America?
Yeah.
The conflation of science fiction to just be part of escapist pop culture does distress me enormously.
Right.
And you say you like thrillers and mystery, and I'll tell you why you do. It's not for the thrill-a-minute read.
Nope.
It's for the in-depth psychological character study.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah. This is what science fiction forgot about in the 50s, and in Asimov is a classic example of a guy whose notion of psychology is teenage boy psychology. It's the thriller writers. And in horror, why do people who don't like even being scared read Stephen King? It's because the in-depth psychological exploration People don't think of Thomas Harris as a horror writer, wrote Silence of the Lambs and the other Hannibal Lecter novels. But they read him nonetheless because the in-depth exploration of psychology, some normal and some aberrant, is what draws us to these books. And science fiction got a bad rep, thanks to George Lucas, in large measure, for being really simplistic characterization. There's no depth in Princess Leia, Han Solo, or Luke Skywalker. They are archetypal, simplistic characters on classic, in Luke's case, hero journey stories. You know his story. As soon as you know it's a riff on the hero's journey, you know, okay, I know his story. I don't have to see the 9 films. I don't have to even see the second film. I know what his story is as soon as you say it's the hero's journey. Yep. But you read a really good thriller, and you're exploring aspects of often the dark side in horror and in thriller, but aspects of human psychology that are finely drawn, carefully nuanced, believable, and engrossing.
And I think in your latest book, you've delved into that with real life characters. So that right. Was because all your previous books have either been far into the future or within the next 10 to 20 years of present day. This is the first time you've gone back into the past and written an alternate history, though. So that must have been a deliberate choice on your part to do something new.
Oh, totally. It's my 24th novel, The Oppenheimer Alternative. And the only reason at this point, with my accolades, you mentioned a few at the beginning of the show, and my financial situation, to write another book is because it's going to challenge me to do it. I don't have to turn out 4 books a year, which a lot of self-published writers do, because my books have legs. They garner a significant audience and they'll be read. People are still reading my first novel from 30 years ago. It's still generating decent income. So I have to be challenged. And the psychological challenge of trying to figure out what made people who created atomic weapons, who made it possible for the first time in all of the 100,000 plus years of Homo sapiens history for the species to become extinct at its own hand. What drove people like J. Robert Oppenheimer, my title character, Edward Teller, who wanted even bigger bombs. He wasn't happy with atomic fission bombs. He wanted nuclear fusion bombs, what we now call hydrogen bombs. He wanted to be able to make genocidal weapons. What drives people? Where is the line between genius and madness? And to do those psychological explorations. Yes, The Oppenheimer Alternative is a hard science fiction novel. All of the science in it is real and very carefully delineated for the reader, so you don't have to be a science buff to follow what's going on. But it is the character studies of these geniuses, to a person, a genius, who shaped the course of not just the second half of the 20th century, but really humanity for the rest of time, will have to deal with the fact that any one genius madman, or now just a madman who has acquired the fruits of genius, right? Kim Jong-un and Kim Jong-il, they weren't madmen. They were geniuses. They were madmen. And they do have nuclear weapons, and they want to use them. India and Pakistan have literally saber rattled, that is swords, for an awfully long time, people in that part of the world. But now both those countries are nuclear powers, and all it takes is one unhinged guy in one of them to unleash them. And we're facing World War III. And as Einstein, who was one of the characters in my novel, The Oppenheimer Alternative, said, I do not know what weapons the Third World War will be fought with, but I do know what the Fourth World War will be fought with: bows and arrows, because we will be knocked back to the Stone Age.
Would be apropos at this time to do a summary of what the Oppenheimer Alternative is all about.
Sure. In real life, J. Robert Oppenheimer was tasked with bringing together the greatest physicists alive to race against time and try to develop an atomic bomb in order to defeat Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler did, with a single bullet to his own skull, what $2 billion of taxpayer money had failed to do, which is bring about the end of the Third Reich. And yet, you can't just say, well, we missed the deadline and sorry, we spent all that money.
Mm-hmm.
And so the emphasis was changed over to using the bombs against Japan. Even though Japan was making overtures to surrender, even though Japan said, just let us keep our divine emperor, Hirohito, and we will stand down. The Americans said, no, we got to use these bombs. We got to show, not Japan, they were defeated. We got to show the Soviets, we got to show Joseph Stalin who's going to be in charge in the post-war era. We have nuclear bombs, we're going to use them. That created great interpersonal conflict amongst the scientists, and almost all of them, Edward Teller being the notable exception, wanted some sort of redemption for what they had done. But real life denied them that. Well, I contrive a circumstance in the Oppenheimer Alternative where during the last days of the Second World War, they discover an instability in our sun. Their research into fusion weapons, the super hydrogen bomb, which was the successor for the atomic bomb, leads them to realize that our own star is unstable and that the planet Earth is likely to be destroyed by the sun sometime by the middle of the 21st century. And so instead of dispersing into academia, all of these great minds, Robert Oppenheimer, Edward Teller, Enrico Fermi, Hans Bethe, I. Rabi, Leo Szilard, Albert Einstein, stayed together and aided by Wernher von Braun, tried to find a way to turn around what Oppie had famously said, now I'm become death, the destroyer of worlds, and let them all say, if they succeed, now we are become life, the saviors of our world. That's the Oppenheimer Alternative by me, Robert J. Sawyer, in a nutshell.
Very good. I believe you've said that research is one of your favorite parts over the writing process.
Not one of, it's the
right. So this part must have been a goldmine for you because you've got so many real life characters in this book. I mean, even Stephen King with 11/22/63, the JFK assassination, he had, maybe half a dozen characters that he had to really research, but you've got like at least a dozen.
Yes. Every character in the novel.
Every character
is a real human being.
Yeah.
And not just a real human being, but a famous human being. In other words, not everybody knows who I. Rabi is, Nobel laureate, but a lot of people do. Not everybody knows who Hans Bethe was, but a lot of people do. A lot of people who knew them in life are still alive. They have children and grandchildren still alive. I couldn't just make up who they were.
Right.
As I could with every other novel. I had to study them in depth. And most of all, my main character, J. Robert Oppenheimer, and learn everything there was that was learnable about them to make them not just work for the purposes of my novel as characters, but to have people who really knew them say at the end, this rings true. Right. My great colleague and friend, Gregory Benford, was a fine science fiction writer. I mentioned him earlier in the interview because he and Larry Niven have their new collaborative novel, Glorious, just came out. Greg was Edward Teller's grad student. So he knew intimately one of my main characters. He read my novel. He said, Sawyer's portrayals ring true. I mean, that meant the world to me to get this right. But to do the research, I was in hog heaven. As I've often said, I only write novels to support my research habit. I got to somehow monetize all.
Right.
And when somebody does something like the 11/23/63, have I got the
11/22?
11/22/63, excuse me. That King did, or that Michael Crichton did when he wrote Dragon Teeth, which was putatively about real feuding paleontologists from the Gilded Age in the American Old West, O.C. Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope. It disturbs me when people only have cameo or small parts of their novel about the real characters, because that's, in some ways, it's a get out of jail free card. At that point, you can paint those real characters in only the broadest stroke.
Right.
People say, yeah, Kennedy said "apak the ka" in Harvard Yard. He had a Boston accent. Okay. Oh, you nailed him. You nailed him. He couldn't say ours. Perfect. You got him. All right, man. That's Kennedy, right? No. You got to get really deeply into these characters and put them front and center, or else I think you're cheating a little bit when you do historical fiction. The most famous example, ironically, is Ben-Hur. Ben-Hur is based on a novel. Charlton Heston played Ben-Hur. You buy the novel. Now, I'm not a religious man at all, but the novel's full title and subtitle is Ben-Hur, A Story of the Christ. Anybody who's seen Ben-Hur knows that Christ has a cameo, right? Like, it's not a story of the Christ at all. It's not a story of Jesus at all. But when you sell it, it's a story about this guy who might as well be entirely fictitious due to Ben-Hur, right? Nobody knows anything about him. You can make up anything you want about this guy. But when you sell it as being about this character that people believe they know all about, and then you don't deliver on that, I really think it's a bait and switch. So when I wrote the Oppenheimer Alternative, I said, not only am I going to give you Oppenheimer, I'm going to give you Albert Einstein, I'm going to give you Wernher von Braun, I'm going to give you Presidents Roosevelt and Truman, I'm going to give you people that you have heard of, people that you think you know about, and people that if you go to Wikipedia after you read my book, you will find that what I wrote about them was accurate and reasonable.
Right. And so did you find in the process of the fiction writing, were you walking a tightrope of I'm constantly checking my research against what I want the story to do? Or did you have enough research done that it sort of just, you felt comfortable with the characters?
I trusted that there would be a story to be found.
Right.
I put on my archaeologist's hat. The problem with most authors doing research is they say, here's the story I want to tell. What 3 or 4 facts that I find that will shore that up? When I start a project, I'm a tabula rasa. I go in and I just follow my nose. So for instance, I knew about J. Robert Oppenheimer. I knew he was responsible for the creation of the world's first atomic weapons.
Right.
I didn't know that he was also responsible for the notion of a black hole. Did you know that?
No.
Right? Most people don't know that.
No.
Oppie was the first published a paper, published 3 of them, as a matter of fact, in the late 1930s about the notion of black holes. He was the first to describe them in terms of a relativistic framework. And he didn't name them, but so Oppie was not an atomic physicist before the war. He was an astrophysicist. Well, that led me on this route that ultimately led me to the fusion. And he was very interested in what happened to old stars, right? He knew that stars had a lifespan, which was quite recent knowledge, by the way. It was only 1925, not even 100 years ago, that we found out what stars were made of, right? That's how recent we thought. Until in 1924, the year my dad was born, we thought that the sun and the earth were basically made out of the same stuff, rock.
Right.
And the difference was that the rock on the sun was super molten, so hot that it gave out enormous amounts of light and heat energy. It was 1925 that a female physicist finally figured out that the sun was in fact made out of mostly hydrogen and some helium.
Right.
And then it was shortly after that Leo Szilard, one of the main characters in my novel, figured out the nuclear chain reaction, fission, and subsequently we figured out the fusion chain reaction that powered, it was Hans Bethe, one of the characters in my novel, that figured out the nuclear chain reactions that power us. This is all in living memory. This is not, ancient history that we knew how the stars work. And Oppenheimer was right in the heart of that, saying, what happens when a star exhausts its hydrogen fuel, turned it all into helium? What happens then? And white dwarfs and ultimately from white dwarfs, which are deeply condensed stars, we get black holes. So this, not knowing where it was going to lead me, led me to a plot that let me have Oppenheimer put back on his astrophysicist's hat after World War II.
Cool.
But if I had gone in thinking Oppenheimer, atomic physicist, and just looked at that, I never would have found the Oppenheimer Alternative.
Well, that's very cool. We're running long, and I apologize. I do have one more question, if you're okay.
Sure.
If not, okay. I think one of the attractive things about your novel, too, is because there's like a stereotype for scientists of being very naive about the real world situation of something that, or implications of something that they're developing. I think one of my favorite series, science fiction series, Fringe, dealt with John Noble's character, Walter Bishop, and the consequences of what his work wrought. And basically the whole series was about him coming to terms with that. And this is something that you've incorporated into your novel as well. And I thought that was really refreshing, because lots of times scientists are really portrayed as being, clueless about the real world, but totally focused on what they're trying to create.
Absolutely. And this was one of the central conflicts in the Oppenheimer Alternative, is Oppie kept saying, the best and brightest men, he said men, it was a sexist time, in Washington are figuring out the policy matters. It's not for us to question them. And Leo's, just because we're scientists, Oppenheimer's, we don't have no special insight. And Leo Szilard said, are you out of your mind? Because we're scientists, we understand how the world actually works. Because we're intellectuals, because we're geniuses, of course we have special insight. My God, they should be so lucky that we want to consult with them on what they should do with these weapons and whether they should be used at all or not. And the conflict between whether scientists should be involved in policy was a fascinating one. And there was, and Oppenheimer was, of course, a bit two-faced here, because on the one hand, he was telling Szilard, no, we should have no special say. On the other hand, as a Machiavellian character behind the scenes, he's pulling strings. But we went through this, and Edward Teller, who was the principal model for the character of Dr. Strangelove in Stanley Kubrick's film with the same name, was, you see that right there in the war room of the Pentagon in Dr. Strangelove. You see this physicist right there as one of the chief advisors to the president during an enormous crisis with the Soviet Union, right? The idea that scientists are the ones who can, really assess what threats are and how to deal with them, I think is such a fascinating issue. And today we face an existential crisis, which I parallel, hopefully don't hit people over the head with that, but a parallel in the Oppenheimer Alternative, which is global climate change and COVID-19, the denial of scientific expertise. They say, oh, you guys don't know what you're talking about. We don't have to listen to you.
Yeah.
Well, the fate of the human race right now is based on listening not to nuclear scientists, although that specter has never gone away, but is listening to climatologists and meteorologists, and listening to epidemiologists and virologists. And the fact that we're refusing to listen to those guys and letting public policy be set by, in the case of, Donald Trump, well, if we did fewer tests, we would have fewer negative, we'd have fewer bad findings. We wouldn't look as bad. Yeah. And if we don't wear masks, we will not look as bad in the photo op. I mean, we're literally dying as a species by not listening to scientists right now. And that's one of the undercurrents of the Oppenheimer Alternative.
Yes. So that makes it even more timely and relevant. So you can't plan for these kinds of things, but they often do happen. And that this is the situation where your book has come out in, and it makes it even more relevant. So that's pretty cool.
The COVID parallel, of course, I didn't plan for and would never wished on anybody. The climate change parallel was definitely in the back of my mind as I was writing the book. It is very deliberately, it's referenced even obliquely. As Oppenheimer says at one point, in the 1940s, what if we discovered that the world was warming inexorably unless we did something about it? What would we do about it? And he says, just go on squabbling like usual, which is exactly what we did.
Yeah. Sadly, sad but true. Okay. So your book is out. Was out on June 2nd, and it's available at all the major outlets.
The Oppenheimer Alternative, you'll find it in bookstores now that they're reopening. Buy from your local independent if you can. If they don't have it, they'll happily special order it for you, the Oppenheimer Alternative. ebook in all your favorite formats, Kindle, Kobo, Nook, Apple Books, whatever you like, and in audio at Audible and all the other audiobook vendors.
Very cool. And you mentioned off the top that is this your last book, or are you?
It's my most recent book. It's my ultimate book. Whether it's my last depends on a number of factors. Mm-hmm. Partially, how well this one does. And I'm toying with another novel idea even as we speak. I'm doing the research, and again, tabula rasa. I'm not sure where it's going to lead.
Okay.
Believe it or not, what I'm researching most of all right now is dogs.
Okay.
For a science fiction writer, I'm researching dogs. And I think it's going to lead somewhere very, very interesting.
Cool. Well, Rob, we've gone over time, and I appreciate you taking the time for this interview. I know that you're a busy man, and it's always awesome to have you on. You were my first guest on these bonus episodes, so it's nice to have you back.
Oh, I well remember that, Lou, and I'm very, very grateful to you, my friend.
And I am grateful for you. And likewise, I feel like I've had a private con presentation by you today.
It's my absolute pleasure.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Rob. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, and I look forward to whatever you decide to do in the future, of course. And hopefully next year we'll be able to see each other face to face again.
I'm looking forward to that, Lou.
Okay. And to all our listeners out there, go check Rob's book out and go to his website, sfwriter.com, and you can find all his books and lots of other material there as well. And as usual, stay safe, but stay scared. The end.